Malcolm Burnley is a staff writer for the Philadelphia Citizen. He has been a journalist in Philadelphia since 2013, contributing to outlets such as Philly Mag, WHYY, and Politico Magazine. He joins us today to talk about the blue wave in Bucks County on Election Day, what lessons we can learn from it, and what it may signal for the midterms in 2026. Hi, Malcolm. Welcome to The Signal.
Hey, Cyril. Thanks so much for having me.
5 days before the election, you published an article at the Philadelphia Citizen, What a Bucks County Sheriff's Race Can Tell Us About U.S. Politics. In it, you explored the question of whether Democratic sheriff's candidate Danny Ceiseler had the formula for how Democrats can win on public safety. Well, the formula seemingly worked for his race, as he won by a 10% margin and more than 25,000 votes. First, what was it about his campaign that drew you to it, and why do you think he was ultimately successful?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on it there. I was interested in a Democrat really embracing a message around public safety and also framing himself as kind of the common sense or sensible, and even you could say even more centrist candidate around public safety. And Republicans, across the country for really, generations have tended to side themselves with law enforcement and kind of have taken up that mantle more. And all things being equal with candidates, it seems like Republicans tend to perform better in races that involve positions of public safety and law enforcement. So I was really interested, if Danny Ceiser's campaign could potentially present an alternative to that. And then I think secondly, he's very youthful, he's very charismatic. So outside of kind of the specific issues, it was interesting to see and watch his campaign unfold, because as we know, not only with Democrats, but especially with the last presidential election and the way it played out with Joe Biden, there's been, a huge conversation about the need to get younger candidates. So I was very interested in both the idea of what he was specifically running for, but also, if a younger, seemingly more centrist candidate also could build some momentum.
What was it about his message around public safety that made it unique for you and that differentiated himself from the incumbent Republican sheriff, Fred Harran?
Yeah, I think so. Danny Ceiseler really spoke about restraint and also getting back to kind of the core functions of the position of sheriff, which, from his opinion and clearly the opinion of a lot of voters, the sitting sheriff, Fred Harran, has gotten away from. And the campaign and the race really became centered around the issue of ICE and immigration enforcement in Bucks County. And so the sitting sheriff, Fred Harran, controversially entered into a 287G agreement, which is known as a task force model around local law enforcement cooperating with ICE. And Danny Ceiser really, hammered him on this during the campaign, and really made an appeal to voters that not only would he get rid of that or pull out of that agreement, but also that it was reflection of the office and the person running the office of sheriff, that he had maybe gone outside the normal bounds of expectations and responsibilities of the job. And so, and to tie it back to my first answer, I think there's been, at least in the national media, there's all these touch points that come up, and including the protest in the summer of 2020. I think that candidates on the right and politicians on the right have really tried to frame themselves as, the common sense, the sensible, right? There's all this chaos happening. You have to vote for us to pull that in. And in this case, with everything that's happening with ICE around the country, and, I think plenty of Americans, even who supported Trump, think now that that's gone too far. It was interesting to see a Democrat using that playbook, if you will, even though the what they were talking about was, certainly very different, right, than what was happening in 2020. But yeah, I found that really interesting. So ICE really was, I would say, the core issue of this race.
What about Sheriff Harran's role as a candidate, his personality and his campaign as a whole?
Yeah, Sheriff Harran's an interesting figure. As I got into in the piece, and as you know really well, he's been around in Bucks County for a long time. He was the director of public safety or in the police department in Ben Salem for over 30 years. And a lot of people have noted, which certainly came up in my reporting, that they feel like there's been a stark change in his behavior, his candor, and really what he's stood for since he's been elected. And so when he was in Ben Salem, those were appointed positions. And then this is his first full term as sheriff, which is an elected position. And so a lot of people have noted a seeming cozying up with Trump and representing more of a hardline position around immigration and ICE, and the 287G is a part of that. I was very intrigued because he says that that's been vastly overblown, and he says, the 287G agreement, which we can get into more, but he says, it's been misrepresented as to how he is going to use that, and he still very much presented or tried to convince me, that he was a lot more centrist and remains that way. Interestingly, when he was in Ben Salem, he did try to get one of these agreements signed back in 2018, if I believe, 2018, 2019. And so to his point, you could look at that one of two ways. It didn't happen in Ben Salem because there was resistance, but you could say, he's always been somewhat of a hardliner or along those lines regarding immigration, and the rest of his approach to law enforcement hasn't changed, and maybe that's just become, as ICE and as immigration has become a bigger national issue, maybe he stepped into that. But a lot of people do really feel like he's fundamentally changed, because he was known as someone who was willing, not only willing to build bridges, but was a pretty good had a pretty good relationship with a lot of folks in the community, NAACP, folks who, a lot of organizations that you would consider being, to the sense that they're political, representing issues on the left, right? Or defending, I guess, priorities on the left. So yeah, so I was fascinated by this idea that, Danny Ceiseler framing him one way, he's saying something else, and ultimately voters having to choose between who they really believe on that.
Yeah, the 287G program with ICE, that's been pretty controversial for a long time. I would say dating back to 2011 when the Obama administration had suspended it after the Department of Justice concluded that Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the self declared toughest sheriff in America, someone who Trump had later pardoned when he became president, the DOJ had concluded that Sheriff Joe had engaged in a pattern and practice of constitutional violations and racial profiling while participating in this program. And it led to lawsuits for Maricopa County, where they're paying like hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think that was one of the concerns, with a lot of folks outside of the actual acts of racial profiling, constitutional and human rights violations. And this is something that we're seeing, if you're paying attention to the news, if you're watching the nightly news, if you're reading the newspapers, you're seeing this all across the country, whether it's a father getting ripped out of his car while dropping off their child at school, to an ICE agent doing like a Derek Chauvin impression with their knee on someone's neck while punching them in the head and while they're restrained. So, I think for me personally, I just found it odd, maybe, or disingenuous that Sheriff Harran seems so surprised that people in the community were worried about potentially masked, armed, and largely unaccountable ICE agents descending upon their community and just kind of, marauding in the streets.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I mean, I think the fear is warranted, clearly what we've seen in other parts of the country. I mean, what he said and would say is two things. One is, it hasn't happened yet in Bucks County, at least leveraging this 287G. And so, I think his argument was, he didn't say this directly, but if I'm going to abuse it, you can vote me out next time, or there you can complain when it actually happens. And he was saying, Danny Ceiseler was kind of connecting national issues, localizing them in Bucks County, even though maybe they haven't happened yet. And I think to a degree, you could say that's accurate. But the flip side of that is what is being said about how he's going to use the 287G and these new powers versus what it allows him to do, kind of words versus actions. So even though those actions maybe haven't happened yet, it's vastly expanding those powers, and there would be nothing really to stop him from going in that direction. And so that was really fundamentally, I think, Danny Ceisler's argument is, you know, I I don't want those powers. I don't think those powers should be in the sheriff's office. And if you don't want to live with that fear or that potential, vote for me. And what Sheriff Fred Harran was saying was, I will use discretion. I will use this in rare circumstances. Why wouldn't I want every tool at my disposal to do my job? But fundamentally, right, elections, there's a lot of words said during elections. There's a lot of promises. And we all know that it's very hard to hold people to them. And so, I think ultimately voters seem to side with Danny Ceiseler in the sense that they don't want that threat looming over their community.
I mean, even if we take Haran at his word that, he was going to be cautious and use his discretion and, maybe be the one municipality in the United States, which is not embroiled in controversy around this, it didn't help him that, this was what Tom Home and Borders are essentially said, that they were only going to go after the worst of the worst criminals. And then he moved the goalpost like 50 yards to the right and said that anyone here in the country that doesn't have proper documentation, anyone here that's here illegally, well, they're criminals. And so they're going to get swept up in this dragnet.
Yeah, and we've seen too, in this Trump era of politics, we know that Trump operates often trying to intimidate or, leverage relationships too. And so, Fred Horan says that he doesn't have a relationship with the White House, but who's to say that Trump wouldn't try to lean on someone like him to be like, you have to use this, or you have to, kind of carry marching orders in the future, right? It opens up definitely the potential for misuse in a number of ways. And I think, another thing I found really interesting about this race is that Haran signed or entered into the agreement, started the process of that much earlier this year, I believe in February. And it was only the ACLU filed a lawsuit challenging it, which was eventually thrown out by a judge in October, just a few weeks before the election. And over those roughly 6 months, we've seen public opinion, I think, on Trump's immigration policies certainly sour. I don't have numbers in front of me. And there's certainly still plenty of people who support what he's doing, but there's plenty of people who voted for him, plenty of people, center right, who are disgusted by what's happening. And, Joe Rogan being one of them, who, a lot's been made of his kind of pulling back and saying this isn't what I voted for, right? This rounding people up at the supermarket, seeing in front of their children, right? And so over those 6 months, I think that public opinion has soured, and it's also interesting to consider whether Haran genuinely wanted this or whether he thought entering into the agreement might be politically advantageous for his election. I think regardless of the reason, over the course, it clearly ended up over the course of the time where it was being challenged, it clearly he didn't come out looking good. And so I also find it, fascinating to think about what was going through his head and just kind of the alternative path if maybe he just had just waited and how voters would have viewed him, because the race really did become a referendum about this agreement and about his views on it. And if he had simply held off, I still think Danny Ceiseler would have won, given the Democrats' success, pretty much up and down the ballot. But there was a lot more blowback and to the 287G agreement, and Harran has yet to even use it, right? So it's interesting to consider like what were any of the benefits to that for him.
Yeah, and going back to your premise around Danny Ceisler's messaging around public safety, he is not a quote unquote open borders radical leftist, as people in the Bucks County Republican Party would want you to believe. I mean, he's not against handing over violent criminals to ICE that are here illegally in the country. But his point, and it was an important point, is that you don't need the 287G program to do that. And I think that was just a solid position by Ceisler, and that was really just kind of like common sense public safety messaging that you were talking about just earlier, and your article as a whole. But let's go ahead and pivot now to the general election. We were just talking about how the Bucks County Democratic Party had a blue wave, or it was called a blue tsunami in the NBC. They swept all the row office elections: district attorney, prothonotary, recorder of deeds, and county controller. And each of them won essentially by the same percentage points, about 10%, about 25,000 votes. And then up and down the county, from local townships to boroughs to your school board races, it was just Democrat after Democrat after Democrat getting elected to their respective positions. So, how much of this, was Ceisler's victory against Harran actually part of ICE, or was it part of a broader backlash against dissatisfaction with Trump's first year in office? Or, that ICE has to actually, plays a part in that, I think, that
Right,
kind of
right.
backlash. It's one of the things that people are unhappy with how the Trump administration is handling their massive mass deportation program, in addition to a slew of other things, ranging from kitchen table issues with the economy to just the Trump administration's disdain for judicial decisions, etc.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and it was interesting because Danny Ceiseler, he's very charismatic. I followed him around to a number of campaign events and No King's Day rallies, and where a lot of the other candidates on the ballot were also speaking. And I throwing no shade at any of them, but he was he got a very loud crowd response. I don't maybe I shouldn't say better than everyone else, but he was clearly could command a crowd. He's young, he's energetic. There was a strong response to him. And then, but then, as you noted, it's interesting to look at the results and being roughly the same up and down the ballot. So I don't think we know, for sure about the specifics of his race or the specific candidates versus the rest. It does seem, I think, to be more, I would put more weight into the general backlash against Trump in terms of the credit as to why he won. But certainly, he is someone to watch, both as he's sheriff and if he chooses to run in the future. I think we'll have a better grasp on that probably a year from now during the midterm elections as to how much maybe Democrats, how much this is sustainable for Democrats. But one thing I wrote about in the piece that I think is important here is some people might disagree with this framing, but both Harran and Ceisler to me were presenting visions of, or should I say, we're presenting a narrative about fear and anxiety in this moment. Ceisler, was presenting it as, the Trump administration destabilizing our communities, making our communities more vulnerable, having overreach with the 287G. And conversely, Harran was presenting, our communities are becoming vulnerable due to immigration, right? Or due to he would often bring up Philadelphia, crime from Philadelphia is bleeding into Bucks County and things to that effect. And you could say, Ceisler was more hopeful. You could say these things, but fundamentally, I think that he was also presenting a narrative that was tapping into a real fear people have. But what's important to note about that is, will Democrats next year, or if the blue tsunami continues to the midterms, right? What's the solution they're going to present? What's going to come after this, or is this simply about a ping ponging back and forth that we often see where, a the other party takes the White House, people are become disillusioned with campaign promises not being followed through, and then they give the other party a shot, right? And then, we kind of keep going. So I do hope that, in Danny Ceisler's case, he's spoken about getting rid of 287G. He's spoken about getting back to the core functions of the office. But on a national scale, or even on, a county or state scale, I'm going to be interested to see if Democrats can get beyond just that narrative, right? People are scared, people are fearful. So, you can tap into that, but how do you, eventually get to another narrative that hopefully can be more sustainable?
It's interesting because Harran is convinced that it wasn't ICE that lost him the election. He was just on the Dom Giordano show, the MAGA radio host at 12:10 a.m. yesterday, and I listened in, and he said that that's not why he lost. He claimed that the Democrats didn't run any advertising around that against him. Dom Giordano blames Indivisible Bucks County and quote unquote PhD moms in Doylestown for the loss. Ultimately, I think it was turnout. The Democrats turned out. There was 49% turnout on an off year election, which is just nuts. I mean, that's like presidential type election numbers, and that would be great for the midterms next year. I think if Democrats can kind of replicate that turnout, that serves to their advantage. And then I think some Republicans were trying to suggest that it was the discrepancy in mail-in ballots,
Mm.
but that just seems more like a symptom,
Mm-hmm.
rather than a cause as to why we saw this kind of sweeping blue election here in Bucks County as well as other places across the country.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And getting back to who Danny Ceisler is and who he's running as, right? He's running as a centrist, and so there's always spin, right? I mean, that's what campaigning really is. It's how do you frame certain things a certain way. But to say that indivisible, although I'm sure they endorse. I actually don't know, but I'm sure they probably endorse Ceisler, at least in the general, and things to that effect. The idea that it's a left, it's a progressive, a democratic socialist, movement that's responsible for unseating Harran, I think is inaccurate. And also, I think it actually points to something that interested me throughout this as well, which is, so I'm live in Philadelphia, and certainly reported on Larry Krasner's rise after, which was 1 year after Trump, when he was first elected to district attorney in Philadelphia, 1 year after Trump's first election. Larry Krasner is would fit that mold, right? That far left, reformer, all these things. And the more success that Danny Ceiseler has, and the more he can stick to who he presented himself to be in terms of being a centrist, I think it will be harder and harder for the Fred Harrans, the Dom Giordanos, to cling to that narrative, right? That this is just a far left. This is that's pushing these candidates and things, because it's frankly just not true.
I mean, Ceisler was an Army veteran who served in Afghanistan and got a bronze medal for his service. He's not some leftist, quote unquote, Antifa hippie, right, running for sheriff.
Yeah, and frankly, and I found this fascinating too. When he was in law school, worked at Larry Krasner's DA's office and was very critical of him. And he met his wife at the office. There was things that happened in his life, and he was very straightforward in saying, that's not the style of, number one, leadership, but also that's not the movement that he is representing in any way. So I think that's an important thing for Democrats to consider, right? And I think there needs to be younger candidates across the board, but since 2016, at least a lot of the young Democratic candidates, nationally and locally, that have gotten the most attention have often been further to the left. And so it's really important for the party to cultivate candidates similar to Danny Ceiseler, not only because we know in a place like Bucks County, you know people tend to split tickets, although not in this election. People are looking for more moderate voices, but also, yeah, to be able to genuinely combat that narrative, which I think has been vastly overblown, that Democrats are just winning because they're swinging fully the other way against Trump, and so yeah, so I think Danny Ceiseler is representative of something potentially hopeful, although there needs to be more candidates who kind of fit that bill.
Let's keep our vision trained on the midterm elections. One thing I'm left wondering is what was Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick's reaction to the election this week? I think it would have to be a little unsettling for him. One, with the turnout, two, with the way people voted. Do you think that this gets the Republican congressman, forces him to come out from his cocoon? Because this is someone who refuses to give public in-person town halls, who very rarely, you could count on one hand, maybe on two fingers, how many times he makes himself accessible to local media. He really just stays in his bunker as a way of kind of like protecting this image that he's crafted, that he's some kind of moderate bipartisan problem solver. Although I've racked my brain and looked at his record, I'm not sure how many pieces of consequential legislation he can claim that he's actually crafted or helped push over the finish line. But what are your thoughts about this race, this congressional race, which is really going to be, have all eyes across the nation looking at? And on top of that, with his likely opponent, at least at this point, the front runner is Bob Harvey, Bucks County Commissioner, a Democrat with really deep and strong roots locally.
Yeah, I'm also fascinated by this. And, the one at the outset of this part of the conversation, the one thing I'll say is that Fitzpatrick has proven time and time again to kind of defy a lot of trends, defy a lot of maybe expectations of what based on how the rest of a ticket performs. So anything I say, is probably with a grain of salt. He certainly has won. When Josh Shapiro, went into the governor's seat, Fitzpatrick won handily that same year. All that being said, I do think this, you would think, inevitably will have to pull him to make more public appearances. I think the longer, this seemed like a clear indication Bucks County, his constituents, are more upset with the GOP than they have been in a while, and more upset with the president. And the more, or say, the less public appearances that he makes, less comments he makes, the more I think people will associate him with the presidency, with the White House, and with those policies. He's done a great job of, as you outlined, being able to point to a bipartisan record, and regardless of the consequence of the legislation. And so he's kind of been coasting on that. It sounds like a, and I don't mean that to be insulting, but just he's been riding on that and trying not to interrupt that narrative. And I think what the elections this week showed is that's going to be harder and harder to do. So I'm fascinated to see how he's going to position himself, because I think the lack of comments maybe is some, to a degree, just how he personally likes to operate, but I've read into it that it's also trying to ride the fence, if you will, between not calling out the leader of the party, the leader in the White House, by saying something negative, while also not trying to appear to be too close to the Democrats on the other hand. So I think he'll have to make some comments. I don't know how. I don't envy that task, because we're in such a hyper, polarized environment. So he'll try, but I think that Bob Harvey, definitely will have a good opportunity, if he's able to stay on message and to kind of exploit that lack of comments, exploit the lack of stands that Fitzpatrick has had to make. The more clarity that he can say, well, I don't know what my opponent feels about this, but I feel this way. I think that that potentially could be a winning message.
Yeah, and I think the more that Harvey puts himself out there, because he's been doing town halls, I've talked with his campaign. They plan on continuing to do that, hold them up and down Bucks County throughout the election. I think that puts even more pressure on Fitzpatrick to put himself out there publicly and to have to potentially explain his votes, whether it's, voting to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, something that he
Mhm.
supported, which I found odd for a so-called moderate and non-Trumper, to some of his other kind of unseemly votes where he's kind of just really fallen in line with the MAGA Republican Party. And like you said, he's going to find himself in a really tough spot because on the one hand, the brand of the Republican Party is pretty toxic right now, and it starts at the top with Trump. But on the other hand, if he distances himself too much from that, he's going to piss off his base and, big time MAGA figures in the county, like, Republican fundraiser Jim Worthington, who has a lot of clout locally.
Yeah, and I thought it was funny. Just one little like footnote to the Fitzpatrick stuff is that Georgetown University, their political science department, I believe, puts out this ranking of the most bipartisan members of Congress every year. And Fitzpatrick, for a number of years, was always listed number one. You could dig into the methodology and quibble with it, but whatever. It's one data point. But this year he moved down to number three. And I thought it was interesting. And not that that's necessarily relevant in and of itself, but maybe just a indication of it's becoming harder and harder. Maybe to hold that position. With votes like renaming the Gulf of Mexico, things like that, right? It's becoming harder and harder to kind of hold that ground. At least that's what I took away from it. So yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, take someone like Liz Cheney. I'm not a huge fan of hers. She probably had one of the most conservative voting records in Congress, yet she crossed the president on one thing, and she drew the line at democracy. Um, something Fitzpatrick didn't have the courage to do, and support the impeachment, and she got ousted from the party for it.
Yeah.
And again, like she was like her probably conservative voting record was maybe like I would say like 96, 99%. So it's really interesting how the Republican Party has changed and how it now it's your position and survival in the party is almost predicated to your loyalty to one person, and that's Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I do, it's all a matter of perspective, but I do think the Democrats have succeeded in some ways in minimizing some of these litmus tests. I mean, again, everything's gotten so polarized, especially since 2016, but it's just bringing me back to this conversation about Democrats and public safety, right? In 2020, there was a lot of talk about defunding the police, and maybe a litmus test wasn't a proper way to say it, but all sorts of politicians, elected officials were being asked to have a position, in terms of the Democratic Party about defunding the police. I haven't heard that, right? And much or anything kind of to that effect more recently. I bring all that up to say, I think there's still maybe a little more of that mentality on the right and in the Republican Party these days, about if you don't do this, you're out, or red lines that are being crossed. And maybe I'm painting with too broad of a brush, because there's certainly issues like Israel and Palestine that divide the Democratic Party. It's not to say that there's cohesion necessarily, but my hope is, again, with like a Danny Ceiseler, right? 5 years after 2020, when we were talking about defunding the police, was really at the center of a lot of conversations. You have a moderate centrist Democrat running on public safety, where those kind of things haven't come up. And so I guess another way to put it is like, it seems like a lot of voters are looking at what is happening with ICE and what's happening with the Republican Party, with the National Guard being deployed to Washington, D.C., and saying that is extreme. And so as much as I think Democrats can kind of keep the focus on things having gotten out of whack on the other side, I think it's a winning message. And not to keep reiterating myself, but again, always the question then becomes, if they do succeed, right, what comes next, right? Not just running as the opposition or just running as the alternative, but what's really the plan? What's really how are we going to satisfy some of those people who have voted for Trump and who do see a narrative about safety and vulnerability? They see it very differently. So yeah, how are we going to present, or how are they, I should say, how are they going to present something that can at least cut through some of that noise?
Yeah, I mean, while the GOP kind of runs a really iron-fisted kind of grip on the party members in Congress, I will say they do have a big tent within its grassroots base, where someone like a neo-Nazi like Nick Fuentes, being a white nationalist is apparently isn't a disqualifying feature for you to be invited into conservative circles, like getting interviewed by Tucker Carlson or being defended by someone like Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, who's also the kind of intellectual architect behind Project 2025.
Yeah, the big tent conversation is so interesting to me because yeah, I mean, you can look at it a lot of ways. Yeah, you can have a big tent, like you said, with the GOP these days that doesn't always let in the folks you would think you would want to let in. But hopefully, I'm glad you brought up that language actually, because my what I was just speaking to, I think there's a hope that maybe the Democratic Party can slowly expand that tent, at least to on issues like public safety, to allow in, yeah, some more moderate voices. Not that they haven't been there, but the extent that those candidates could catch enough attention or be fully supported, right? Amidst, in other areas of the country, though, clearly we just had Zoran Mandani. I mean, there's going to be, candidates still on further to the left that are going to be appealing. So yeah, can there be a big enough tent policy wise that can allow for both and to find enough common ground and not to go in the other direction of the Big Ten of kind of basically anyone who's willing to take a blood oath, we'll let you in. That's obviously not, from my perspective, not the type of tent that you want.
Yeah, you were talking about, you had brought up policy. I think that's something that, Democrats are really going to have to craft their message with more so for the midterms and the congressional elections, and getting back to economics, that's going to be a big part of it. Like, what is their economic alternative? I feel like Trump's tariff policies have kind of created chaos within the economy, especially with the pricing of goods. And what are Democrats going to offer in order to kind of win back, some independent working class voters that kind of, because of their dismay with past Democratic policies, drifted over to Trump? I think like that's where it's interesting. You were talking about like bringing some more people in the center, into the Democratic Party. But I actually think progressive populist economics
Mm,
can be something that actually marshals people back to the Democratic Party and just kind of brings back some of the working class base that the Trump campaign has been able to kind of peel off. I mean, if you go back to NAFTA, where I think it's
mm,
really started, in the modern times, like in the early 90s, like if Democrats had listened to progressives and
yeah,
unions,
yeah,
there wouldn't be that economic backlash because, and that was Bill Clinton that really pushed that. The first George Bush tried to, it failed in Congress. Clinton got elected, and then he was the one who wanted to kind of thumb his nose at his union base and working class base, and that really helped usher in this kind of like corporate globalization that left a lot of working class communities behind and abandoned them, whether it was in, coal town in western Pennsylvania or a manufacturing town in Ohio. I'm on the lookout personally. I'd like to see some more progressive economic policies, coming out from the Democratic Party and within congressional races, and even something you might hear from Bernie
yes.
Sanders, who had a really broad economic appeal.
I mean, that's exactly where I was going to go. I mean, it's the pandemic was such a like mental just dark hole, but like at least I forget, Bernie Sanders was winning the primary, right? Before everything shut down, and there was a good chance he could have won. And we all know the conversation about how many people voted right for Bernie and Trump, or sometimes Trump, Bernie, Trump. I mean, I know some of those were primaries versus generals, but still, there's the working class, that populist economic policy and appeal. I think it needs to be revisited. And I think it's interesting, thinking about public safety having maybe a more centrist position, right? But economics wise, the America first mentality, is now so tainted by Trump, right? But like that's a message that appeals to a vast majority of, or a lot of people for exactly the reasons you outlined, right? Like kind of a shift back from globalization, at least, thinking about bread and butter issues. And even Mamdani in New York, obviously that's a very unique case. New York's a very unique circumstance, but I find what him staying on message about rent, right? About very basic things, about lowering the cost of goods. I believe that's why he won. I know there's again, you could say, Indivisible or all these progressive groups, are lifting him up, but I think what he was really successful about was staying on message with that. And because it's just very clear that appeals to people. And New York's a great case too, where, all these corporate interests, right, have kind of ruled the day for so long. And we saw them kind of coalescing, around Andrew Cuomo, towards the end, at least is my perception, trying to coalesce to, I think, protect those more global economic interests. So yeah, I think that's a message that Democrats really do have to revisit, and maybe there's a way to package it a little bit differently this time. That allows the ideas to rise above the rhetoric, right? The Fox News rhetoric of that's going to say socialism's taking over the country and all those things. I think they're going to have to be clever about how to package it, but the substance of that is, I think, it's a winner, and I think Bernie showed that, and I think in some degree maybe Trump bastardized some of it, but
Oh, he definitely did. I mean, he was talking about trade, and what I would argue is that he he flipped it upside down, whereas like he was blaming immigrants, right, for taking American jobs, whereas as me as a kind of lefty progressive, I'm blaming the
yeah,
corporations, the multinational corporations, and the CEOs for outsourcing, shutting down factories and outsourcing jobs, whether it's to Mexico and Vietnam, because they want to maximize their profits, because these countries have weak labor laws, very little environmental laws, and like no accountability or enforcement for anything.
yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of there was a great clip since the last election that I saw. It was a conversation between Mark Lamont Hill and Chris Hedges or Hitchens. I always mix them up. Hitchens, I don't believe is
Hitchens is dead, but
yes,
maybe it was
exactly,
Hedges.
exactly. So Hedges, thank you. But he was just kind of talking about like the oligarchs or kind of the corporate interests and how much including in the Democratic Party, just how much influence they've gained, and really about how so many election issues come down to, those very wealthy corporate partners trying to protect the advantage that they have. Yeah, I think the populism, I think that it's still possible to break through some of that. Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the populism that Trump represented so far seems to be, there's been a pretty strong backlash to, and including the economic policies, but the underlying angst and the underlying just day-to-day issues in terms of that led to those policies still exist. So my hope is, voters and people will be able to, they won't stop looking for solutions, even if we've struck out on a few, whether it was the stimulus checks or some of the long termers effects of from the Biden administration, or yeah, Trump's the tariffs and things. That seems to not be the answer either. So yeah, I think that will be defining the midterms for sure.
So, Malcolm, before I let you go, are there any other last lessons that you saw Tuesday night, either in Bucks County or in another race, whether it's like New Jersey or Virginia or somewhere else across the country? Are there any lessons from these Democratic victories that you think should be on the top of people's minds locally as they start getting ready to organize and mobilize for 2026?
Yeah, I love that question. It actually, I think one lesson broadly is that outside money, as much as I think it's distorted a lot of our politics, and I would certainly like to go back to pre-Citizens United in a heartbeat. The spending doesn't always, and I would say, I think rarely, a political scientist would know better than me, but rarely actually motivates voters. Maybe in some individual cases, or a certain advertisement that really, is really able to cut through the noise. But we saw so much spending, whether it was the state Supreme Court races, or in New Jersey, Micah Sherrill's campaign, opposition to that. And even Danny Ceiseler, I'll have to get the final fundraising numbers, but he told me that he believed this was the most expensive sheriff's race in the history of Pennsylvania. And then we saw the outcome ultimately was, as you noted, was roughly the same margin of victory, as all these other races. So did any of that money make any difference? I would say probably not. It was marginal. And there's something hopeful there. So I don't think the money's going away. It seems like, sadly, we're going to keep breaking records with that. But I do think there's something hopeful within that, speaking to the populism or the economic populism, right? Speaking to like messages that, as much as we can complain that the American people are not educated enough or making decisions, you don't like a way election runs, and you're saying, how could you vote against your best interests, blah, blah, blah. I think the money is not influencing, and the advertisements aren't influencing them that much. So, I think there's an opportunity for ideas, there's an opportunity for policies, and for people to vote, and also to vote for the people, for better or worse. So I do think that message is important. And my hope is that, especially for the Democratic Party, heading into the midterms, they'll consider some of that, and they'll, whether it's individual candidates or the party more collectively, will be able to stick to a message and maybe not be swayed by negative campaigns, right? And hopefully we'll be able to actually present something that really appeals to voters, as opposed to just, let's just spend money to frame the opponents, a certain way. Because I think, unfortunately, as we've seen in many recent cycles, the more that happens, the more we're just going to end up back in that position again, because people will, then the Republicans will do the same thing, and they're just, again, ping pong back and forth. So yeah, I think, the another reaffirmation that, money doesn't always win elections is something I want to take forward, and hopefully long term we'll get some type of change on that.
Well, Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us today and for coming on The Signal. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that you'll come back and join us again sometime soon.
Absolutely. I would love to be back, and it was a great conversation, Cyril. So thanks for having me.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Migaleko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.